Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a grain of rye, golden in the summer sun of 1691. Now imagine that same grain, but this time harboring something ancient and terrible, a fungus that would spark one of the most infamous chapters in American history. What if I told you that the Salem witch trials, those terrifying months when neighbor turned against neighbor, when children's screams echoed through courtrooms, when 20 innocent people lost their lives, might have begun not with the devil's work, but with bread? Today, we're going to explore one of the most fascinating and scientifically compelling theories about Salem, that a microscopic fungus called ergot may have lit the fuse that would explode into America's most notorious witch hunt. Section 1. The Perfect Storm of 1691. To understand how a fungus might have changed the course of history, we need to step back into the world of Salem Village in 1691. Picture a community already stretched to its breaking point. The Little Ice Age had gripped New England for over a decade, bringing the coldest winters and wettest springs anyone could remember. Crops failed year after year. Families who had once been comfortable found themselves scraping by, watching their children's faces grow gaunt with hunger. But 1691 brought something different. Hope, perhaps, in the form of an unusually wet spring. After years of drought, the rain felt like a blessing. Fields that had been barren began to show promise. The rye crops in particular seemed to flourish in the damp conditions. What the farmers of Salem Village didn't know, what no one in 1691 could have known, was that those same wet conditions were creating the perfect environment for something else to flourish alongside their precious grain. Claviceps purpurea, ergot, a parasitic fungus that thrives in exactly the conditions Salem Village experienced that fateful spring. The fungus begins its work invisibly, infiltrating the developing seeds of rye, wheat, and other grains. As it grows, it replaces the normal grain with dark, curved growths called sclerotia, structures that look almost like tiny horns sprouting from the grain heads. To the untrained eye, these infected grains might have seemed harmless enough. Perhaps darker than usual, perhaps slightly bitter when ground into flour, but in a time when any grain was precious, would a family really throw away their entire harvest because it tasted a little off? And so, as summer turned to autumn in 1691, the people of Salem Village began consuming bread made from grain that contained one of nature's most powerful psychoactive compounds, a substance that would, centuries later, inspire the creation of LSD. Section 2. When bread becomes poison. Let me take you inside a typical Salem Village home in the winter of 1691. The family gathers around their simple wooden table for the evening meal. The firelight flickers across tired faces as they bow their heads in prayer, grateful for what little food they have. The bread before them is dark, dense, made from rye flour ground at the village mill. It's slightly bitter, but it fills empty stomachs. No one could imagine that this daily sustenance might be slowly poisoning them with a cocktail of ergot alkaloids. The children eat first, as was customary in Puritan families where the young were fed before the adults. Young Betty Paris, the 9-year-old daughter of Reverend Samuel Paris, her cousin, 11-year-old Abigail Williams. These girls, consuming their daily portion of ergot-contaminated bread, would soon become the first accusers in Salem's witch trials. But what does ergot poisoning actually do to the human body? What would these children have experienced as the alkaloids built up in their systems week after week? The symptoms are as terrifying as they are varied. Convulsions that twist the body into impossible positions. Hallucinations so vivid they feel more real than reality itself. A burning sensation in the limbs so intense that victims feel as though they're being consumed by invisible flames. What medieval Europeans called holy fire, or St. Anthony's fire. Imagine young Betty Paris waking in the night, her body contorting involuntarily, seeing shadowy figures that her rational mind tells her cannot be there, but that appear as real as the wooden beams above her bed. In a deeply religious community where the supernatural was already a daily reality, where the devil was believed to walk among them, how would such symptoms be interpreted? The children began to exhibit what their community could only understand as evidence of supernatural affliction. They spoke of being pinched and bitten by invisible hands. They claimed to see specters of their neighbors performing dark rituals. They writhed and screamed during prayer services, their bodies seemingly beyond their own control. What's particularly heartbreaking is that these children were likely telling the truth about what they experienced. Their hallucinations were real to them. Their physical torment was genuine. They weren't lying or pretending. They were poisoned. And in a community already fractured by economic hardship, political uncertainty, and religious extremism, these symptoms would light a fuse that would consume 20 innocent lives. Section 3. When Science Meets Superstition. The breakthrough in understanding Salem's possible connection to ergot poisoning came not in 1692, but in 1976. A graduate student named Linda Caporal was studying the Salem witch trials when she noticed something that had escaped historians for nearly 3 centuries. The pattern of accusations didn't follow what you might expect from a typical witch hunt. Instead, they seemed to cluster in specific households, in particular areas of Salem Village, and they began and ended at very specific times. Caporal began to investigate what might have caused such a precise geographical and temporal pattern. What she found was remarkable. The areas where the most accusers lived corresponded almost exactly to the areas where rye was grown and where the wet, marshy conditions would have been perfect for ergot contamination. But perhaps even more compelling was the timing. The accusations began in earnest during the winter and spring of 1692, exactly when families would have been consuming the grain harvested from the wet summer of 1691. And then, mysteriously, the accusations began to fade in the fall of 1692. Why the sudden change? The summer of 1692 had been unusually dry. Any new grain harvested that year would have been free from ergot contamination. As families began eating the new, uncontaminated harvest, the symptoms that had been attributed to witchcraft began to disappear. The historical record supports this theory in ways that are almost eerie in their precision. Weather records from the period, kept meticulously by Puritan colonists, show that 1691 was indeed one of the wettest springs on record, followed by 1692's drought conditions. But Caporal's theory becomes even more compelling when we look beyond Salem to other documented cases of ergot poisoning throughout history. Between 591 and 1789 AD, European records document over 130 major outbreaks of ergotism, and the symptoms described in medieval chronicles read like eyewitness accounts of Salem's afflicted girls. French villagers dancing uncontrollably until they collapsed from exhaustion. German peasants claiming to see demons and devils. English communities where children fell into convulsions and spoke of being tormented by invisible spirits. The parallels are striking. What makes the ergot theory so compelling is not just the symptoms, but the way those symptoms would have been interpreted by a deeply religious community in 1692. In an age where natural and supernatural explanations were deeply intertwined, where illness was often seen as divine punishment or demonic influence, ergot poisoning would have seemed like nothing less than the devil's work. And so science and superstition collided in the most tragic way possible. Section 4. When Theory Meets History. Of course, no single theory can fully explain the complexity of what happened in Salem. The ergot poisoning hypothesis, compelling as it is, doesn't account for all aspects of the witch trials. Political tensions, economic rivalries, personal grudges, and religious extremism all played their roles in the tragedy that unfolded. But what the ergot theory does provide is a lens through which we can understand how a community of reasonable people might have been pushed over the edge into mass hysteria. It offers a bridge between the supernatural explanations that seem so real to the people of 1692 and the rational understanding we seek today. The implications extend far beyond Salem Village. If ergot poisoning did contribute to the witch trials, it reminds us how environmental factors, things as simple as weather patterns and crop conditions, can have profound impacts on human history. It also speaks to something deeper about human nature and the way we interpret unexplained phenomena. When faced with symptoms they couldn't understand, the people of Salem reached for the explanations available to them within their worldview. They weren't ignorant or malicious. They were human beings trying to make sense of terrifying and inexplicable events. Today we have the scientific knowledge to recognize ergot poisoning for what it is. We understand the neurological mechanisms by which ergot alkaloids cause hallucinations and convulsions. But in 1692, such knowledge was centuries in the future. The people of Salem could only work with the understanding they had. The ergot theory also highlights how interconnected our lives are with the natural world in ways we rarely consider. A fungus growing in a rye field, influenced by weather patterns shaped by global climate cycles, potentially altering the course of American legal and religious history. It's a reminder that we are not separate from nature, but deeply embedded within its cycles and patterns. And perhaps most importantly, the ergot theory offers us a form of redemption for the people of Salem, both accusers and accused. If the initial symptoms were caused by poisoning rather than malice or delusion, then the children who made the first accusations become victims rather than villains. And the community that believed them becomes not a mob of superstitious fanatics, but a group of people trying to protect their children from what they genuinely believed was supernatural harm. Section 5. What Salem still teaches us. As we sit here more than 3 centuries after those dark months in Salem Village, what can this small New England community teach us about ourselves and our world? First, it reminds us that the line between rational and irrational behavior is often thinner than we'd like to believe. The people of Salem weren't fundamentally different from us. They loved their children, feared for their safety, and tried to make sense of a world that often seemed chaotic and threatening. When their children began exhibiting terrifying symptoms, they responded with the tools and knowledge they had available. The ergot theory also teaches us about the importance of asking what if. For nearly 300 years, historians accepted the standard explanations for Salem: religious extremism, social tensions, mass hysteria. It took one graduate student asking a different question to open up an entirely new way of understanding these events. Perhaps most importantly, Salem reminds us that our search for explanations, whether supernatural or scientific, reflects our deep human need to find meaning in suffering. The people of 1692 found meaning through their religious worldview. We seek meaning through scientific inquiry. Both approaches reflect the same fundamental human impulse to understand why bad things happen and how we might prevent them. In our own time, when we face unexplained phenomena or frightening events, we too reach for the explanations available within our worldview. The question is not whether we seek explanations, that's simply human nature, but whether we remain open to new possibilities when old explanations prove inadequate. Salem Village teaches us that truth is often more complex and more interesting than our first explanations suggest. And sometimes the most profound answers come from the smallest, most overlooked details, like a fungus growing quietly in a field of rye. The next time you see a field of grain swaying in the breeze, or smell fresh bread baking in an oven, remember the story of Salem Village. Remember how something as simple as weather patterns and crop conditions might have set in motion events that would echo through American history for centuries. The ergot theory doesn't solve all the mysteries of Salem, and it may never be definitively proven, but it offers us something perhaps more valuable than certainty. It offers us empathy for the people who lived through those terrible months and insight into the complex ways that natural and human history intertwine. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this theory. Do you find the ergot explanation compelling? What other historical mysteries do you think might benefit from scientific investigation? Share your reflections in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's most intriguing mysteries, consider subscribing to join our ongoing exploration of the quiet stories that shaped our world. Next time, we'll be visiting another place where science and history intersect in unexpected ways, uncovering more of those fascinating details that make the past feel both distant and surprisingly familiar. Until then, may your bread be free from fungus and your curiosity forever fed. Thank you for listening,